Hello everyone. Let's continue our learning in object-oriented programming. In this lecture, I want to introduce inheritance and polymorphism to you. I want to use an example to show you what they are and how we can apply them to software and mobile application project development. Before we talk about inheritance and polymorphism, let's learn two new concepts. The first one is called a superclass. The second one is called a subclass. A superclass is a class that can be used as a more general prototype. For example, in our project, we could have a class called a player. We could have the second class called driver. We could have the third class called a student. But no matter which class we are talking about, a player, a driver, or a student, all of them should have a first name and last name as a human being. So we want to summarize these common features among classes a little bit more and create another prototype called a person. And then in the person class, no matter we talk about a player, a driver, or a student, a person should have a first name and a last name. Then we want to use a person class as a superclass. Remember, the superclass is a class that can represent some other classes. A superclass can be used as a more general prototype. Then we have the definition of a subclass. A subclass is the child class that is derived from a superclass. For example, the player class is a subclass of the person class. The driver class is also a subclass of the person class. Now we can talk about the definition of inheritance. Because we develop a subclass based on the superclass, then a subclass should have every methods, every properties that a superclass has. For example, if in the superclass person we have a method called showName, and then we develop a subclass called a player based on person class, then the player class should also have a method called a showName, even though we don't have to repeat the code showName in the player class. This is the example of inheritance. Of course, I will show you the code later in this lecture. Let's remember the definition of inheritance. Inheritance refers to a process that a subclass can inherit all properties that a superclass has. Then we have another definition called a polymorphism. Polymorphism refers to that a subclass can develop its own methods. Just like a child can inherit the DNAs from his or her parents, but the child will also grow his or her own features. This is the example of polymorphism. Now I want to use an example to show you how we can implement inheritance and polymorphism in the Java programming. In this example, I want to create a superclass called a person. Very similar to the previous lecture, a person class should have a first name variable and a last name variable. I want the user of this class to give me two string type values. And then in the person class, I will have a method called showName. No matter what the values the user give me, I want to use the showName method to show the person's first name and last name. Because this one is very similar to the previous lecture, I will not repeat the basic OOP concepts here. Let's just copy the code from the person class. Let's make a copy of the person class. Next, let's open the Notepad application and then paste the code into it. I have the person code. Based on the person class, I want to develop a new class called a player. Because each player should have a first name and last name, that's why we believe that the player class is a subclass of the person class. Also, we want to borrow the showName method from the person class into the player class so that we can show each player's name. Let's develop the code. Create a new line and then type in public class player. If we just want to develop a player class from ground zero, we can type in the curly braces, right? But now we want to indicate a player is a subclass of the person class. We have to use the keyword extends. So let's type in extends after player. And then after extends, you want to type in person. This means the player class is a subclass based on the superclass person. And then you can type in a set of curly braces. Let's move the closing curly braces to the end. Because each player should also have a first name and last name as well, right? Let's create these two variables. They are string type. Let's call them private string pf name. I want to use pf to represent player's first name, to differentiate player's first name from a person, a general person's first name, and then semicolon. And then let's create another one. Let's call this private string pl name, player's last name. After we create the variables, we want to show the user of our class how they should use the class, right? We call the way of using our class a constructor. So let's type in public. Let's create a new line to indicate the relationship a little bit more. Public player, and then a set of parentheses. Between parentheses, we want to type in string player first name, comma, string player last name. Here I create two new variables, right? Player first name and player last name. As I showed you last time, these will be the values given by the user of our class. We don't know what each player's real first name, real last name will be. That's why we create these two variables, player first name and player last name, to represent two variables that can accept each player's input. For example, I have a player called Eric Smith, right? Then Eric will be accepted by the player first name in the future. Smith will be accepted by player last name in the future. If you forget the definition and how to create a constructor, please review the previous lecture. And then we want to type in a set of curly braces. Between curly braces, right, we have a new method called super. And then let's type in a set of parentheses. Between parentheses, we want to type in player first name, comma, player last name, and then type in semicolon. What does this mean? We just said that we want to borrow the showName method from the person class to the player class so that we can show each player's name. But if you take a look at the constructor of the person class, if you want to use person class, according to the constructor, you must give two string values to this constructor so that you can activate the person class and use all methods inside of the person class. That's why when we want the player class to use all methods inside of the person class, after a player gives us his or her first name and last name, we want to immediately give these two string values to the constructor of the superclass person so that we can activate the superclass person and make a player use all methods from the person class. The way of giving the values from the subclass to a superclass is a function called super. This is how you deliver the values given to a subclass to the superclass of this subclass. We use a super to deliver the value. At this moment, we actually have completed the player class. Let's create some real players so that we can see how we can use the showName method in the player class. I will not repeat the code here. I will just copy from the PowerPoint. Let's copy from the public static void to the second closing curly brace. Let's copy this block and then make a copy. In the Notepad app, between the two closing curly braces, between the two, right? Let's paste the code we just copied. Let's just create one player. Let's remove player 2, these two lines. Let's just have one player, right? Let's copy this code and then paste it into the online interpreter. Let's remove everything from this online interpreter and then paste what we developed. And then click execute. Now you can see I create a new player called Eric Smith, even though I didn't develop the showName method in the player class. I can still activate the superclass person and borrow it into the player class. That's why when we use player1.showName, this method, we are able to show the player's first name and last name on the computer screen. This is the process of inheritance. As you can see, the subclass player doesn't have a code related to showName. We just inherit showName method from the superclass person. This process is called inheritance. What is the benefit of using inheritance? Now let's think about it this way. Let's replace person with Windows 8. And then let's replace player with Windows 10. Everybody knows that Windows 10 is a newer version of Windows 8. So Windows 10 should have some expanded service, but the core service of Windows 10 is from where? It's from Windows 8. If we use inheritance to develop an extended version of a software, we can keep all the useful code from the previous version and inherit all the useful code from the previous version into the latest version. By doing this, we can save time and cost when we develop a newer version of a system or a mobile app. This is the benefit of using inheritance. Let's talk about polymorphism. Let's take a look at how showName method print each person or each player's name. It will show the person's first name first, last name second. But what if, for the players, we want to show each player's last name first, first name second? Definitely, the current showName method in the superclass person cannot satisfy what we want to achieve. We have to create another version of showName, particularly designed for the player class. Let me show you how. Let's go back to the Notepad app. Above public static void main, above this line, let's create a new line. Let's type in public void showName, and then parentheses, and then a set of curly braces. As you can see here, we created another version of showName method. The main structure of this showName is as same as showName in the superclass person. And then because we want to print the order of first name and last name differently, so let's copy this print function and then paste into the showName method in the player class. Here I want to change this person to this player because this method is particularly designed for player class. So let's type in this player's name is, we want to show the player's last name first, right? Which variable represents the player's last name. PL name, this represents the player's last name. So let's change F name to PL name. And then create a space. Of course, we want to show the player's first name second, right? Which variable represents the player's first name? PF name. So let's remove L name and then change it to PF name. Now the method will show the player's last name first and then first name second. We have this structure. We changed the order of showing different variables. But does our class know the values for each variable? It doesn't know. Why? Because in the constructor, we haven't given each values given by the user to the variables in the player class. So below the superclass line, let's create a new line and then type in pf name equals to player first name, semicolon. Then PL name equals to player last name, and then semicolon. Some classmates may have a question. Professor, we already used the super method to accept the user's values, right? The values given by the user. Why do we have to create these 2 extra lines? What is the purpose of super function? It's to deliver the values given by the user to the superclass. So even though we give the 2 string values, for example, Eric Smith, we give these 2 values to superclass. We haven't given these 2 values to the variables in the player class yet. That's why we have to create 2 extra lines. We need to use pf name equals to player first name, pl name equals to player last name, to have our class player recognize which value should give to which variable. After we create these 2 new lines, when a player gives us Eric Smith, our class will know that Eric should be given to the pf name variable. Smith should be given to the pl name variable. And then the show name method will show Smith first, Eric second. This is the newer version of show name, particularly designed for the subclass player. Let's copy our code. Let's copy all code and then paste them into the online interpreter. Let's take a look at what changes we can make. Let's remove the previous version, remove everything, and then paste the newer version. And then click execute. Now you can see the output is this player's name is Smith Eric. Now let's remove player1 and player1.showName, these 2 lines. Let's remove them. I want to challenge everyone a little bit. First, I want to type in equals to, and then I want to type in new player, and then parentheses. I want to create a new player. Let's call this player Tina Williams. Tina is a string type value, the comma, and then 2 double quotes, Williams, and then semicolon. In front of the equal sign, I want to type in this. I want to type in person player2. Can anyone tell me, can I create a variable called player2, but after the equal sign, I use new player Tina Williams? Can I do this? What is the difference between player 2 and player 1 we just removed? When we create a player 1, we typed in player 1 equals to new player Eric Smith, right? That's reasonable because we can create a player variable, player 1, to represent this new player Eric Smith. But this time is different. I want to create a new player by using new player Tina Williams. By doing this, I create an object under the player class, right? But this time, In front of player 2, I didn't use player. I use person. I typed in person player 2 equals to new player. Can I do this? The answer is a yes. Why? Because we just discussed the relationship between a superclass and a subclass, right? We said a subclass is developed based on a superclass. Then whatever object we created from the subclass should still belong to the superclass. Other developers will write this statement in another way. He will write player 2 equals to new person Tina Williams. Does this work? Not at all. Why? Because person Tina Williams belongs to the superclass. We cannot give a superclass object to a subclass. Another way to put it is a player a person? Definitely. But is a person definitely a player? Not at all. Some people may not play games at all. So you cannot give a person object to the subclass player. This way of writing the statement is not correct. But the other way, person player 2 equals to new player Tina Williams. This will work. As you can see, a player object can be given to either a player variable or a person variable. These different ways of representing the same object is called a polymorphism. Now I have another question. Let's say we want to create a new line. Let's type in player2 dot show name parentheses semicolon. I have a question. Will Tina be showed first or Williams be showed first? The answer is Williams will be showed first. Why? Some classmates may say, okay, I create a variable player2 and the type of player2 is a person. So if I go back to person, I want to look for show name. According to this way, first name will be showed first, right? Tina will be showed first, right? But if you take a look at what player 2 really represents, it represents which type of object? A player type object. So how the name will be showed will be determined by player class. Then if we go back to the player class, we find that last name will be showed first, first name will be showed second. That's why Williams will be showed first in the result. Let's click execute. Let's take a look at the real result. Now you can see our argument has been verified. Williams, which is the last name, is showed first. Remember the relationship between subclass and superclass. More important, you want to identify the result will be given according to inheritance and polymorphism relationship.